So I'm going to go through today, I'm missing some graphics here. I'm going to run through a high-level overview of how we regulate software and AI-based medical devices, some of the regulatory carved-outs that we have that we introduced in 2021, some observations about what we've seen in AI-based software and how we regulate it, go through some of the roles and responsibilities of all the players, particularly relating to pathology, and also some proposed changes that will be coming through and some activities that the TGA is participating in. So software as a medical device, software that either incorporates software or they are standalone software. And it comes down to the intended purpose of the medical device. So as soon as you're assigning an intended purpose that includes a diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, prediction, prognosis or treatment of a disease, an injury or a disability, you go into that category of software as a medical device and you're regulated by the TGA. We do have, I guess, what I want to emphasise is what we mean by intended purpose and functionality. So I'm sure many of you have a meat thermometer in your kitchen drawer at home that you use for checking the temperature of your meat when you cook it. The software in that digital thermometer is likely the same as the software in a thermometer for clinical use, but it comes down to the intended use. We don't regulate your meat thermometer, but we do regulate your digital thermometer for measuring the patient's temperature. So that intended purpose is really important. Our regulatory framework is technology agnostic. So that means it doesn't matter what form the software is presented in. So it might be installed on a smartphone or a laptop as an app. It might be supplied in the cloud, or it includes AI or machine learning. All of those different types of technology all come under the definition of software as a medical device. And taking it even further, the type of AI is covered. So we're covering machine learning, neural networks, large language models such as ChatGPT. That's really important because as soon as you've got a ChatGPT or any LLM that includes that functionality of being intended for use as a medical device, so that diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, those key words, it comes under our regulatory framework. So I just want to go through some of the regulatory terminology that we use, and to put it in context, so we have a medical device regulatory framework, and IVDs are a subset of medical devices. So in order to be an IVD, you must first meet the definition of a medical device. We had the IVD regulatory framework that Andy went through earlier, introduced in 2010, that includes the regulation of in-house IVDs. In 2021, we did some fairly significant changes to the medical devices regulatory framework. It included the introduction of some classification rules that are described as programmed or programmable medical devices. Now, those classification rules didn't impact IVDs. The IVD classification rules have remained largely intact since they were introduced. But in 2021, those classification rules actually brought a lot of medical device software into a higher risk classification because we have a risk-based regulatory framework and it upclassified quite a lot of those software products. We also introduced some additional essential principles. So those who are familiar with the regulatory framework for IVDs know that every medical device needs to comply with the essential principles for safety and performance. So we introduced some additional rules relating to cybersecurity, version control and data management, privacy of data, and labelling requirements. So that all came into being in 2021 as part of government measures that were introduced. We also included some additional regulatory mechanisms. So what you can see up there is exempt and excluded. So even though those two words sound quite similar, they're really different in meaning. So exempt means that products are not required to undergo pre-market regulatory approval, but they do still need to meet specific regulatory requirements. These include things like adverse event reporting, complying with the advertising rules, but they don't need to be included in the ARTG. The other side of that are excluded products which don't meet. They're not considered to be medical devices. So those are carved out, and we use that term carve out because they're pushed out of our regulatory framework. Okay. So I'm going to go through in a little bit more detail about some of the exemptions and the exclusions. So there's only one type of exempt software. So that's clinical decision support software. So CDSS are software technology products that support or enable clinical practice. They're used for aggregating and displaying data, providing prompts or reminders, and they help a practitioner in implementing established clinical practice guidelines. So they don't replace the role of the clinician. They're not intended to diagnose or make treatment decisions, and that software mustn't change or modify any of the data input in any way. We don't allow it to take outputs from another medical device in. Then if it does that, it doesn't meet those exemption criteria. So those three criteria that you see on the screen are actually the wording in the legislation. And ultimately this exemption is intended to reduce the regulatory burden on low-risk medical devices. Sorry, I'm losing my voice already. So reduce that regulatory burden, but it still allows the TGA some regulatory oversight. So if your CDSS products don't meet those three criteria, it doesn't mean that they can't still be supplied. It just means that they need to go through that pre-market regulatory approval process. So it's clear that not all CDSS software are exempt. And we recently undertook a consultation about this particular exemption just to clarify some of those requirements and really make it clear that software that's consumer-facing is not an exempt CDSS. It doesn't include IVD software as inputs, and even if it's labelled as CDSS, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's exempt. It still has to comply with those requirements. So I'm just going to go through some of the excluded criteria. So what you have on the screen are the products that the TGA does not regulate. So there are 15 conditional exclusions in our legislation to carve them completely out of our regulatory framework, divided into 6 categories. So we have things like consumer health products. So they don't provide any specific treatment suggestion. So they're general health and wellbeing type things, wellness apps for weight loss, symptom checkers, diaries, smoking prevention, and those sports devices that have a fitness watch, or say they're monitoring for your physical activity. As soon as your fitness watch includes something that flags as atrial fibrillation, that has a medical intended purpose, so that wouldn't be excluded. Digital health tools are also excluded, provided they're based on established clinical practice guidelines that are referenced and displayed in the software. And those products, so we're talking about things like cognitive behaviour tools, the regulatory oversight for those is provided by the Australian Commission for Safety and Quality of Healthcare. They have a set of voluntary accreditation standards. We've also got enabling technology, such as telehealth software that's excluded, or digitisation of paper-based records, which might previously have been in a physical paper-based form. The other thing I wanted to mention specifically here are the laboratory information systems, because they are relevant to the sector. So, excuse me, I'm getting a very dry throat immediately. So LIMS that enable laboratories to automate workflows, manage orders, samples, associated information. So where they don't include functions of diagnosis, so they can present the informations and the outputs of your laboratory testing. As soon as they're making diagnostic or treatment suggestions, they're actually being pulled back into the regulatory framework. And what we're seeing is that while we had LIMS that might have been introduced at the beginning of the IVD regulatory framework, and they may have met those exclusion criteria in 2021, there's a lot of additional functionality that software developers actually put into their products. They roll them out. Often the users are not even aware of it. It's just a version change or an upgrade. And it's really important because a lot of the time those products are actually being pulled back into a regulatory product. They're making decisions about and changing the results and the outputs of those pathology results. So they are a regulated product, and we know that there is a compliance issue in this space. So I want to go through some of the things that we've seen. Oh gosh, is that grey? Can you actually see that? So some of the points about what we've seen in AI-based medical devices. I've clearly not been talking enough all day. And some of the gaps that we're seeing. So there's a lot of new products that are coming through, particularly in the last couple of years, and lots of diversity in how AI is being used. So AI is frequently used as part of an ecosystem. There might be cloud-based components. There's different components of software. Sometimes they're sourced from different manufacturers, different suppliers. There's incorporation of open source software into products. So as soon as you're a manufacturer of software, your name is on that product, you take responsibility for the outputs of that software, even if it incorporates open source software. And that presents an issue when there are changes made to that software that change the functionality of that product, often changing the intended purpose. The incorporation of AI is not always immediately visible in the design of the product, not to the TGA, not to the user. And because we're dealing with software developers are often they're not used to working in a regulated environment. They're new to regulation, they don't know the requirements. So there's a large amount of education included in our role just to get those products through the regulatory process and approved for supply. Data that's used for the training and testing of AI-based products is often not provided, or it's not well elaborated. And the models that we're using are frequently developed on data that's sourced from overseas. We're seeing it's not relevant to the TGA population. There's no commentary or relevance to Australia and how it's being used. There may well be an overlap, certainly with the Australian population, but it's not clear, and we're actually seeing that is introducing quite a lot of bias into the products, and it's really challenging for us to actually unpack that. Excuse me, I've got such a tickle in my throat, it's making my eyes water. So I'm not crying, it's just my... I'll just take a moment just to clear them, and then I'll be able to see my slides, which are in very light grey up there, and it's not intended, I'm sorry. So one of the other problems that we see is that function creep. So we know that software frequently changes and is updated. The suppliers or the vendors of those products are not complying with their regulatory requirements and letting the TGA know. Often the function of that product is changing the intended purpose, even the risk classification of those products. And that's what we're seeing in those laboratory information systems, specifically to the pathology sector. And I guess the key point is that all of this information really slows down a lot of the applications that we receive. It takes us quite a long time and a lot of back and forth between the sponsors and the manufacturer to get the information we need to get these products approved. So the types of evidence that we ask for software developers or the manufacturers of products to provide, there's a standard set of questions, and then depending on the actual function of that software, we ask for additional information. So Products that are Class 2A or 2B or a Class 3 medical device, or Class 2 to Class 4 IVDs, the manufacturer must have QMS certification. Excuse me. So the Quality Management System certification issued by a third-party conformity assessment body or by the TGA, and also evidence of compliance with the essential principles. So we ask for information about the software design, how it performs. We require a detailed description of the software, the architecture, how it's been tested, information about the manufacturer's version control, the defect management, and where it includes AI, details about the algorithm, how it's been tuned, the suitability for use, the data population. So we require all of that information. Generalisability of that data, specifically to the data that it's been developed on versus the intended use population. And any steps that the manufacturer has taken to identify the bias and potential limitations. Also, clinical consideration. So every piece of clinical software requires clinical evidence to support it, and that's a separate process to the development of the product. Information about cybersecurity and data privacy, and also those labelling requirements. So where it's got software that's required to be used by a healthcare professional, we expect the vendor to include information about the clinical validation requirements to establish trust in that software. Sorry, I'm just going to take a moment. My throat is streaming. And I would not have been able to predict that I was going to go. Okay, so I'm going to scoot through some of the regulatory responsibilities that we have. So up here are the requirements for a manufacturer. So the manufacturer is the person whose name is on the product. Okay, so that's essentially the person who's taking responsibility for the product. We also have, thank you, run out of that water. Thank you, that's great. Ah, that's better. Warm water. My eye is streaming, so never mind. I'll keep going. So, in-house IVD manufacturer is also the manufacturer of the product. So, that's where the product is developed from first principles, you're all familiar with, modified or developed from a published source. So again, the manufacturer is assigning the intended purpose. Some of the other functions of a medical device manufacturer, they're responsible for the design, the production, packaging and labelling of the product. They determine the risk classification, which in turn determines the conformity assessment procedure to be applied. They're responsible for maintaining the product technical file and providing all of that information, notifying of any substantial changes to the product, and also the post-market monitoring. Break down a little bit further some of the responsibilities of a sponsor. So the sponsor is the person who supplies, whose company is legally responsible for supplying that product in Australia. We've got NATA, who has the MOU with the TGA that oversees the accreditation of those class 1 to 3 in-house IVDs, and the TGA. And I'm going to scoot through some of these so that we've got time for questions at the end. So up here you've got the responsibilities of a sponsor. And from a laboratory perspective, many of these responsibilities that you see on the screen are not relevant to an in-house IVD manufacturer who also happens to be a sponsor, because in-house IVDs are exempt from inclusion in the ARTG. So you don't have to submit that application, but bear in mind that you still do have to submit that notification that you are a laboratory with in-house IVDs and you're the manufacturer. The role of the TGA, I'm going to skip through this. We've got our risk-based regulatory framework just to save time. I think you're probably all familiar with this. And also the role of NATA, which throughout the last 2 days we've heard quite a lot of. Things to emphasise here is that the NATA assessors they really have a detailed knowledge of the IVD regulatory framework, the TGA oversees, They undertake their assessment in conjunction with the 15189 assessment and the accreditation, and also emphasise that the laboratory has those responsibilities around the requirement for the validation, the verification and the documentation for those IVDs that they are using. So, I'll just, excuse me before I have another coughing fit. So, up here on the screen, so there's going to be some changes. So we've already heard, for those who joined the presentation with CSIRO this morning, that there's some budget measures that were announced in May around the review of AI and its safe and responsible use in Australia. So the TGA is part of a multi-agency review which will address several areas, priority areas, one of which is health. And that will include and be part of some broader work around establishing some mandatory guardrails for use of AI in high-risk setting. So that essentially involves a review of the TGA legislation. We're in a really fortunate position that we've had a really robust regulatory framework, which is technology agnostic, for the last 4 years. So we are aware that there are some changes that will need to happen because of AI. Generative AI has been introduced since 2021, and that's had an impact on how we actually need to manage some of those things. So there will be a detailed review, a couple of rounds of consultation, targeted stakeholder consultation and public consultation. Some other changes that are coming, which are relating to software, and again, that's come out really grey, so I apologise that you can't actually see that very well. So when the regulatory framework for IVDs was established in 2010, IVD instruments were classified as Class 1 IVDs. So that was on the basis that the test kits that were performed on instruments typically classified at a higher risk classification, and to avoid that duplication and regulation, the instrument was set as a Class 1. And the performance of that instrument was assessed in conjunction with the test kit. Fast forward 14 years, and instruments have become much more complex. They're often incorporating their own analytical or interpretative functions as part of the software. And a lot of those instruments don't even have separately supplied test kits at a higher risk classification. So we're seeing that we've got a lot of additional functionality that's really presenting significant increased risk. So what we will be doing is undertaking a consultation around some of the changes to classification rules. So instruments such as, say, a blood gas analyzer or breath analyzers for detecting volatile organic compounds, mass specs for bacterial ID, these will all be classified at a higher risk classification based on the functionality of that software. So where the software that's incorporated in an instrument does more than just the basic operation or driving or the influencing of that instrument will be classified separately. If software is supplied separately and installed on that instrument, it will also be classified higher. So just to give you a few examples of some of those products. So diagnostic systems, we've got, say, a digital image, a slide scanner, which might be used for selecting cells and identifying cell changes consistent with cancer or any malignant cells, would be classified as a Class 3 under the IVD classification rules. Flow cytometry analyzer that's grouping and classifying cells, Class 3. Software that's included for selecting cells that are then going to be reviewed by a scientist or a pathologist, where they're not being pre-characterised, would be classified as a Class 2 IVDs. So these are changes which will be subject to classification. The introduction or the proposal of these additional classification rules for software and the changes are in line with what they already have in Europe. So under the European IVDR, and one of our intentions is to align with those requirements. So I think we've probably got enough time for a few questions.
So Andy's actually asked, do LMS systems, which include clinical comments or flag abnormal results, constitute an IVD?
No. So if it's a LIMS which has, so you've got your reference range of your results, and it's just flagging whether it's in or outside, that doesn't meet the definition of a medical device. It's when you're adding additional interpretation, particularly where you've got auto release of results where there's not a scientist. Some of them could well meet the definition of that clinical decision support if they're not changing the results in any way. They're supporting a healthcare provider to actually perform their task, and they're based on established clinical practice guidelines. It could foreseeably be an exempt software, but as soon as it's adding some of those diagnostic functions or suggesting treatment options or follow-ups, then yes, you are pushing into medical device space.
Okay, thank you. And this question, I'm hoping you understand what it means. So would pattern recognition systems, usually AI, to identify diagnostic cells in histo or hematology,
Yes, you got it.
for example, fall into
Histopathogens.
SAMD definition?
Yes, it does. So essentially, as soon as you're incorporating that AI or machine learning in the development of your software or in the function of how that software performs, it's unlikely to be excluded or exempt. There's no transparency. The clinician needs to be able to verify at the point of use how that software is performing. So if you've got an AI tool, it absolutely meets the definition of software as a medical device.
Thank you. I think we have time if you're happy to
Yeah,
do.
absolutely.
Yeah, okay. So what type of software testing is required by the TGA, and does it need to be accredited testing? Very important.
So testing, so depending on the risk classification of the software, so the accreditation is not required of a manufacturer of software. The certification of the manufacturer's quality management system is. So if it's a class 2, class 3 or class 4 IVD, or a class 2A, 2B or 3 medical device, then the manufacturer needs to have a certified quality management system. So bear in mind that that's actually regulating the product that they are producing rather than how they are using it, and the ability of that performance of those staff, which is really the key difference in the accreditation process. So we're looking for quality management system certification of the manufacturer. There are standards that the manufacturer of software need to comply with. 62304, IEC 62304 will be one of the key ones, but also some of the risk management software. And there's also AI standards that are being developed for some of those AI-based products.
Thank you. Okay, we'll have one final question and there'll be time for afternoon tea. Is there a guidance document or criteria for performing a validation available publicly?
So by validation, if you're talking about validation as the manufacturer of the software, we don't have a guidance document that says this is how you are supposed to validate your software. We don't have it for manufacturers either. It's quite a detailed thing, and it's really product specific. It would be quite challenging to even be able to write one. And my mind goes crazy even thinking about how we would approach that. But we would be able to provide some principles and identify the risks. So any time that we're talking about validation of any kind of product, we take it back to the risk. So as soon as you do your risk analysis, and you go through and you identify what is an acceptable risk, what's not, what testing do you have to do to mitigate, what are the things that can go wrong, and what have you done as a manufacturer to address those? Or if you're talking about validation, when you're installing it in your laboratory and setting about, it's actually going through that process systematically and identifying all of those variables and establishing statistically to make sure that you've assured the way that product is going to be used. You've considered all of the variables at the extremes.
Thank you very much. Can everyone please once again thank Fiona for her presentation?